A child prays for her dying mother. A soldier cries out from the battlefield. A grieving father screams at the sky, and the universe remains silent. If God exists, why doesn't he answer? Today, we're diving into one of the most haunting questions in human history: the silence of God. Welcome back to Logic over Spirit, where we explore the deepest questions at the intersection of faith, reason, and human experience. I'm your host, and today we're tackling something that keeps believers awake at night and gives skeptics ammunition: divine silence. Throughout history, billions of people have prayed, pleaded, and begged for answers from God. Some claim they've heard responses, but for most, there's nothing but silence, empty air, an absence so profound it shakes the very foundation of faith. This isn't just a theoretical problem debated in ivory towers. This is personal. This is the mother who loses her child and asks why. This is the Holocaust survivor who watched millions die and heard no divine intervention. This is you, perhaps, wondering if anyone is listening when you speak into the void. Over the next hour, we're going to explore this silence from every angle. We'll examine what theologians say, what philosophers argue, and what this silence might actually mean for the existence of God. We'll look at 8 different perspectives on this ancient problem, and by the end, you'll have a comprehensive understanding of one of religion's most difficult challenges. So settle in, because we're about to confront the deafening quiet at the heart of religious belief. Chapter 1. The expectation of divine communication. Let's start with the foundation. Why do we expect God to speak in the first place? Every major religious tradition tells us that God communicates. In Judaism, God spoke directly to Moses, giving him the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. In Christianity, God became flesh in Jesus Christ, the ultimate form of divine communication. In Islam, the Quran is considered the literal word of God revealed to Muhammad. Hinduism speaks of divine revelations to ancient sages. Buddhism, while often non-theistic, describes enlightenment as a form of ultimate understanding. These aren't subtle suggestions. These are bold claims that the divine actively engages with humanity. The Bible is filled with stories of God speaking, from the burning bush to the voice at Jesus' baptism. Religious texts describe a God who cares enough to intervene, to guide, to communicate. And it's not just ancient history. Modern believers claim personal relationships with God. They describe answered prayers, divine guidance, feeling God's presence. Millions attend churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues every week, engaging in conversations with the divine through prayer and worship. So the expectation isn't arbitrary, it's built into the very fabric of religious teaching. If God is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful, communication seems not just possible but necessary. A loving parent doesn't ignore their children. A teacher doesn't abandon students. A friend doesn't disappear without explanation. But here's where things get complicated. Because for every story of divine communication, there are thousands of stories of silence. For every claimed miracle, there are countless unanswered prayers. The expectation crashes against the reality, and that collision creates one of the most painful tensions in religious life. Think about it from a believer's perspective. You're taught that God loves you infinitely, that he knows every hair on your head, that he's closer to you than your jugular vein. You're told to pray without ceasing, to bring your burdens to him, to trust in his plan. The entire relationship is predicated on connection, on communication, on presence. And then, in your darkest moment, when you need that connection most desperately, there's nothing, just silence. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Either everything you've been taught is wrong, or there's something else going on. This is where our journey really begins. Chapter 2. The problem in its raw form. Let's strip away the theological complexity for a moment and look at the problem in its starkest form. Imagine you're a parent. Your child is drowning in a pool, screaming for help. You have the ability to save them. You're right there. Would you remain silent? Would you stand still? Of course not. The very suggestion is monstrous. Any parent would immediately act. Now scale that up to God, an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being who loves his creation infinitely more than any parent loves their child. This God watches as children die of starvation, as innocents are slaughtered in genocides, as natural disasters destroy entire communities. And from this God we hear nothing, no explanation, no intervention, no comfort. The Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel wrote about watching a young boy hang from the gallows in a Nazi concentration camp. Someone behind him asked, "Where is God?" And Wiesel heard a voice within him answer, "Here he is, hanging on the gallows." The silence of God in that moment wasn't just absent communication. It was abandonment at the most critical juncture of human suffering. But it's not just extreme cases. It's the everyday silence, too. The teenager prayed desperately not to be bullied anymore. The unemployed father asking for help feeding his family. The woman begging for healing from a painful disease. These aren't unreasonable requests. They're not asking for lottery winnings or superpowers. They're asking for basic relief from suffering. And the response is silence. Not even a no. Not even an explanation. Just nothing. Philosophers call this the problem of divine hiddenness, and it's closely related to the problem of evil. If God exists and is good, why would he hide? Why would he remain silent when communication would alleviate so much doubt, so much suffering, so much confusion? The atheist philosopher J.L. Schellenberg argues that if a perfectly loving God existed, he would ensure that all people capable of a relationship with him would be in a position to have one. But many people, through no fault of their own, don't experience any sense of God's presence. They seek sincerely and find nothing. This silence, Schellenberg argues, is evidence that such a God doesn't exist. The problem is simple but devastating. Silence from God contradicts the very attributes religions assign to him, and yet the silence persists. Chapter 3. The Theological Responses. Now, theologians have been grappling with this problem for millennia, and they've developed several sophisticated responses. Let's examine the most prominent ones. First, there's the free will defense. This argument suggests that if God constantly intervened and made his presence undeniably obvious, human free will would be compromised. We'd be compelled to believe, to obey, to follow. The silence in this view is actually a gift. It creates the space for genuine choice, for authentic faith, for real relationship rather than coerced submission. Think of it like this. If a king appeared before you in all his power and commanded your love, would that love be genuine, or would it be fear dressed up as affection? True love requires freedom, and freedom requires the possibility of doubt, of distance, of silence. There's something compelling here, but also something troubling. Does a genuine relationship really require complete silence? Human relationships certainly don't work that way. Parents don't refuse to speak to their children to preserve their free will. Teachers don't remain silent to let students freely choose education. There's a middle ground between compulsion and abandonment that God seems to avoid. Second, there's the divine pedagogy argument. This suggests that God's silence is educational, designed to teach us important lessons. Just as a teacher sometimes steps back to let students struggle with a problem, God's silence might be developing our character, our resilience, our spiritual depth. The medieval mystic St. John of the Cross wrote about the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual dryness and divine silence that ultimately leads to deeper union with God. Suffering through God's absence, in this view, is part of the journey towards spiritual maturity. But this raises uncomfortable questions. How much silence is pedagogically necessary? At what point does educational distance become neglectful abandonment? And what about those who die in the silence, who never experience the promised breakthrough? Third, there's the mystery defense. This argument essentially says that God's ways are beyond human comprehension. We're finite beings trying to understand an infinite God. Our expectations of how God should communicate are limited by our perspective. Perhaps God is communicating in ways we can't perceive or understand. Perhaps the silence serves purposes we're simply not equipped to grasp. The book of Job essentially ends with this response. After Job demands answers for his suffering, God responds with a speech about the vastness and complexity of creation, essentially asking, "Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth?" The implication is that some things are beyond human understanding. This is intellectually honest in acknowledging the limits of human knowledge, but it's also deeply unsatisfying. It essentially shuts down the conversation. Any problem with God's behavior can be dismissed with, "It's a mystery." It becomes an intellectual get-out-of-jail-free card that blocks genuine inquiry. Fourth, there's the argument that God does speak, but we're not listening properly. Maybe we're looking for burning bushes and booming voices when God communicates through conscience, through nature, through other people, through scripture, through subtle inner promptings. The problem isn't divine silence, but human deafness. There's some wisdom here. If God exists, it would make sense that divine communication might be subtle, requiring attentiveness and discernment. But this also seems to blame the victim. The person desperately seeking God and finding nothing is told they are just not trying hard enough or not listening correctly. That's a heavy burden to place on someone already in distress. Each of these responses has some merit, but none fully resolves the tension. The silence remains, and with it, the doubt. Chapter 4. The Philosophical Problem of Hiddenness. Let's dig deeper into the philosophical dimensions of this problem, because it gets even more interesting when we apply rigorous logical analysis. The argument from divine hiddenness can be formulated quite precisely. It goes something like this. If God exists and is perfectly loving, God would desire a personal relationship with all humans capable of such a relationship. A personal relationship requires that both parties be aware of each other's existence. Therefore, if God exists and is perfectly loving, all humans capable of relating to God would have sufficient evidence of God's existence. But many people, including many who sincerely seek, lack sufficient evidence. Therefore, a perfectly loving God does not exist. This is a powerful argument because it doesn't rely on suffering or evil. It's simply about presence and absence, communication and silence. It asks why a loving God would play hide and seek with his creation. The philosopher J.L. Schellenberg has developed this argument extensively. He distinguishes between culpable and non-culpable non-belief. Culpable non-belief is when someone rejects God through willful stubbornness or moral failure. But non-culpable non-belief is when someone genuinely seeks truth and finds no evidence. Schellenberg argues that a loving God wouldn't permit non-culpable non-belief because it prevents relationships through no fault of the person. Think about it in human terms. If someone you loved desperately wanted to know you, sought you out sincerely, and you had the power to reveal yourself, would you remain hidden? Would that be loving? Most of us would say no. We'd reveal ourselves because that's what love does. Love seeks connection, not hiddenness. Some philosophers respond by questioning whether God's love is really comparable to human love. Maybe divine love operates on completely different principles. But this creates its own problems. If God's love is so different from human love that it permits what we would consider neglect or abandonment, then the word love loses its meaning when applied to God. It becomes an empty label that doesn't correspond to anything we actually understand as love. There's also the question of proportionality. Even if some divine hiddenness served a purpose, the degree of hiddenness seems excessive. Surely God could reveal himself enough to eliminate honest, earnest doubt while still preserving meaningful free will and spiritual development. The silence seems disproportionate to any plausible justification. Another philosophical angle comes from the problem of competing religious claims. If God communicates, why are the messages so contradictory? Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism all make incompatible claims about the nature of ultimate reality. If God is clearly communicating, why is there so much confusion? The cacophony of competing voices claiming divine authority suggests either that God is uncommunicating clearly or that humans are manufacturing these messages themselves. The silence, in other words, is made worse by the noise of contradictory claims to have broken it. Here's what makes this philosophically thorny. The problem of divine hiddenness isn't just an evidential problem about God's existence. It's a conceptual problem about God's nature. Even if you believe God exists, the silence raises serious questions about whether this God is who religious traditions claim he is. Chapter 5. The Experiential Dimension. Let's shift from abstract philosophy to lived experience, because the silence of God isn't just a logical puzzle. It's an existential crisis for millions of people. I want you to imagine someone. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah was raised in a devout Christian home. She sang in the church choir, attended Bible study, and prayed daily. Her faith was genuine, her devotion real. Then, at age 16, her younger brother was diagnosed with leukemia. Sarah prayed like she'd never prayed before. She begged God to heal him. She made promises. She fasted. She pleaded. Her entire church prayed. Thousands of prayers went up. Her brother died 6 months later. Sarah felt like she'd been speaking into an empty room. No comfort came, no sense of divine presence, no answers, just silence and loss. Stories like Sarah's are everywhere. They're not exceptions. They're the norm. Most prayers by any statistical measure go unanswered. Most pleas for divine intervention meet silence, and this has profound psychological and spiritual consequences. Psychologists who study religion have documented something called spiritual struggle or religious crisis. This occurs when someone's experience contradicts their religious beliefs. The silence of God is one of the most common triggers. People who experience divine silence often report feelings of abandonment, betrayal, anger, depression, and existential despair. Some people respond by losing their faith entirely. The silence becomes too deafening to explain away. Others double down, interpreting the silence as a test of faith, a refining fire. Still others reconstruct their theology, developing more abstract or mystical conceptions of God that don't require direct communication. But here's something fascinating. The experience of divine silence isn't limited to moments of crisis. Many devoted believers report periods of what they call spiritual dryness, or the absence of God. Mother Teresa, considered a saint by many, kept diaries that revealed decades of feeling abandoned by God. She wrote about darkness, emptiness, loneliness, and the pain of God's silence. If even someone as devoted as Mother Teresa experienced this silence, what does that tell us? It suggests that divine silence is a structural feature of religious life, not just an exception that happens to doubters or sinners. Mystics throughout history have written about this. They describe the via negativa, the negative path, where God is encountered precisely in his absence. There's a whole theology of divine darkness, of unknowing, of silence as itself a form of presence. This is intellectually sophisticated, but it also feels like making a virtue of necessity. If God is silent, reframe silence as a special kind of communication. From a psychological perspective, we have to consider whether reported experiences of God's voice or presence are better explained by internal mental processes rather than external divine communication. The human brain is remarkably good at generating experiences that feel external and real but are actually internally produced. We dream vividly. We hear our name called when no one's there. We sense presences that don't exist. Religious experiences, including the sense of God's presence or absence, might be products of our neuropsychology rather than encounters with an external divine being. This doesn't necessarily make them less meaningful, but it does suggest that the silence might not be God's refusal to speak, but rather the absence of a God who was never there to speak in the first place. The experiential dimension of divine silence is where the philosophical problem becomes deeply personal. It's where logic meets life, where arguments become anguish, Chapter 6. Cultural and Historical Perspectives. The silence of God isn't just a modern problem. It echoes through history and across cultures, though different traditions have grappled with it in different ways. In ancient Judaism, the prophets frequently complained about God's silence. The Psalms are filled with laments asking, "How long, O Lord? And why do you hide your face?" After the destruction of the First Temple, Jewish tradition speaks of the cessation of prophecy. God, who once spoke regularly through prophets, fell silent. This silence became a defining feature of Second Temple Judaism and continues in various forms to this day. The Talmud discusses the idea of Hester Panim, the hiding of God's face, as divine punishment for sin. But this explanation has always been unsatisfying, especially in the wake of the Holocaust. How could the murder of 6 million Jews, including 1 million children, be proportionate punishment for any sin? The silence of God during the Holocaust has been called the greatest theological crisis in modern Jewish history. Some Jewish theologians, like Richard Rubinstein, concluded that the Holocaust proved God either doesn't exist or doesn't intervene in history. Others, like Eliezer Berkovitz, argued that God's silence is necessary for human freedom and that God suffers with his people even while remaining hidden. Still others, like Hans Jonas, suggested that God made himself powerless to allow human freedom, thus explaining both his silence and his inability to intervene. In Christianity, the cross itself can be seen as the ultimate moment of divine silence. Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and receives no answer. The silence of God reaches even the Son of God himself. Christian theology has often interpreted this as God taking on the full human experience, including the experience of divine absence. But this raises questions too. If even Jesus experienced God's silence, what hope do ordinary believers have? Some theologians, like Jürgen Moltmann, have developed a theology of the cross that places suffering and divine absence at the center of God's nature. God is not absent from suffering but present in it, revealed precisely in his hiddenness. In Islam, the question takes a different form. The Quran is understood as the final and complete revelation, the Word of God preserved perfectly. But individual Muslims still struggle with feeling distant from God, with prayers that seem unanswered. Sufism, Islamic mysticism, developed elaborate practices for dealing with the sense of separation from God, seeing the journey toward God as necessarily including periods of absence and longing. Eastern religions handle this differently. Buddhism, being largely non-theistic, doesn't face the problem in the same way. The silence of the universe isn't problematic if the universe isn't personal to begin with. Enlightenment comes through one's own effort and insight, not through communication with an external deity. Hinduism, with its diverse traditions, offers various perspectives. Some Hindu philosophies see the ultimate reality, Brahman, as beyond all communication and relationship. The silence isn't a problem, but a feature of ultimate reality's transcendence. Other bhakti traditions, which emphasize devotional relationship with personal deities, struggle with divine absence in ways similar to Western monotheism. What's striking across all these traditions is that divine silence is a universal human experience. Whether you're a medieval Christian mystic, a Holocaust survivor, a Muslim Sufi, or a modern agnostic seeker, the experience of speaking into the void and hearing nothing back is common human ground. This universality suggests something profound. Either this is a shared feature of genuine religious experience pointing to something real about God's nature, or it's a shared feature of human psychology and the natural universe that contains no responsive deity. The silence itself doesn't tell us which interpretation is correct. Chapter 7. The Atheist Interpretation. Let's be direct. From an atheist or naturalistic perspective, the silence of God has a simple explanation. God is silent because God doesn't exist. The silence isn't mysterious. It's exactly what we'd expect in a universe without a personal deity. This interpretation has powerful explanatory power. It explains not just why God is silent, but why divine communication, when claimed, is so inconsistent, contradictory, and culturally bound. It explains why prayers work at the same statistical rate as random chants. It explains why different religions claim to hear different messages from God. It explains why the supposedly all-powerful, all-loving deity appears powerless and absent in the face of terrible suffering. The atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell once said that if he died and found himself before God, and God asked why he didn't believe, Russell would reply, "Not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." The silence in this view isn't a mysterious divine pedagogy. It's the absence of a phenomenon that doesn't exist. Consider the null hypothesis. In science, when we're investigating a phenomenon, we start with the assumption that there's no effect, no relationship, no phenomenon, and we require evidence to reject that null hypothesis. If we apply this to God, the null hypothesis would be that God doesn't exist, and we'd require evidence to reject that hypothesis. The silence of God fails to provide that evidence. In fact, it's precisely what the null hypothesis predicts. If there's no God, we'd expect no divine communication, no answered prayers beyond coincidence, no interventions, no miracles. And that's exactly what we observe. Some atheists go further, arguing that the very concept of God is incoherent or meaningless. The logical positivists of the early 20th century argued that statements about God aren't even false. They're meaningless because they can't be verified or falsified. The silence of God, in this view, isn't God hiding. It's the linguistic emptiness of God talk being exposed. But let's be fair. The atheist interpretation faces its own challenges. It has to explain why belief in God is so persistent and universal across cultures. Why would humans everywhere develop elaborate religious systems if there's nothing there? The standard answer involves evolutionary psychology, sociology, and cognitive science of religion. We evolved pattern-seeking brains that overdetect agency, which helped us survive, but also made us prone to seeing intentional agents where none exist. Religion provides social cohesion, existential comfort, and moral structure. These functions explain religious belief without requiring any actual deity. There's also the question of religious experience. Millions of people claim to have experienced God in some way. The atheist has to explain all these experiences as illusions, delusions, or misinterpretations of natural phenomena. This isn't impossible. We know brains can generate convincing false experiences, but it does require explaining away a lot of human testimony. Some atheists, like the philosopher Daniel Dennett, have tried to naturalize religion, explaining it entirely in terms of evolutionary biology and memetics. Religion is a natural phenomenon like any other, explicable without reference to any supernatural reality. The silence of God, in this framework, is just the universe being what it is, indifferent, mechanical, silent. But here's what's interesting. Even if the atheist interpretation is correct, it doesn't fully address the human need that makes the silence painful. Knowing that God probably doesn't exist doesn't eliminate the longing for meaning, for justice, for someone to hear us, for the universe to care. The silence remains existentially challenging even after you've concluded it's just empty space. The atheist interpretation is intellectually satisfying for many people. It's clean, it's simple, it explains the data efficiently, but it also requires accepting that we're fundamentally alone, that suffering is meaningless, that no one is listening to our prayers because no one is there. For some, this is liberating. For others, it's devastating. And this brings us to the crux of the matter. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, we have to live with the silence. We have to find meaning, purpose, and ethical grounding in a universe that seems indifferent to our pleas. Whether God exists but remains silent, or God doesn't exist and the silence is just the natural state of things, the practical challenge remains the same. Chapter 8. Living with the Silence. So where does this leave us? We've explored the problem from every angle, examined theological responses, philosophical arguments, experiential dimensions, historical perspectives, and the atheist interpretation. But at the end of the day, the silence continues. What do we do with it? First, we can acknowledge the legitimacy of the struggle. If you've experienced the silence of God and found it painful, that pain is real and valid. You're not weak, you're not faithless, you're not doing something wrong. You're having a genuine encounter with one of the deepest problems in human existence. Second, we can be honest about uncertainty. Maybe we don't know why God is silent, if God exists. Maybe we don't know whether our experiences of divine presence are real or imagined. Maybe we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. Intellectual humility in the face of ultimate questions isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Third, we can focus on what we can control. Whether or not God speaks, we still have to make ethical choices. We still have to treat each other with compassion. We still have to create meaning in our lives. Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, argued that even in the most absurd circumstances, we can choose our response and find meaning. The silence of God doesn't absolve us of responsibility for our choices. Fourth, we can stay open. Maybe you're a believer experiencing divine silence. Perhaps this is a season, not a permanent state. Perhaps your theology needs to evolve. Perhaps God communicates differently than you expected. Or maybe you'll eventually conclude God doesn't exist. Stay open to your own journey. If you're an atheist or agnostic, stay open too. Not to religious manipulation or weak arguments, but to genuine wonder, to mystery, to the possibility that reality might be stranger and more profound than our current understanding allows. Certainty is often the enemy of truth. Fifth, we can find community. The silence of God is isolating, but you're not alone in experiencing it. Countless others throughout history and across the world have struggled with these same questions. Sharing the struggle makes it bearable. Whether in religious communities that allow honest doubt or secular communities that provide meaning without gods, connection helps. Finally, we can embrace the questions themselves. Maybe the silence of God isn't a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Maybe wrestling with these questions is itself valuable, making us deeper, more empathetic, more thoughtful people. Maybe we're not meant to have all the answers tied up neatly. The silence of God, whether it's the silence of an existing but hidden deity or the silence of a universe that contains no gods, is one of the fundamental facts of human existence. We are beings who ask why, who seek meaning, who cry out for justice and love, and we live in a universe that doesn't obviously answer back. How we respond to that silence defines us. Do we despair or find courage? Do we close down or open up? Do we become bitter or compassionate? The silence doesn't tell us what to do. That's on us. Conclusion. We've journeyed through one of the most challenging questions in philosophy and religion. Why is God silent? We've seen that there are no easy answers, only different ways of framing the mystery. Whether you interpret this silence as divine pedagogy, as evidence of God's non-existence, or as something else entirely, the experience of it is a profound part of being human. We are creatures who speak into the unknown, hoping for response, often receiving only echoes of our own voices. But perhaps that's not entirely tragic. Perhaps in learning to live with unanswered questions, we become more fully human. Perhaps the silence, painful as it is, creates the space for us to develop our own wisdom, our own compassion, our own meaning. The silence of God is not the end of the conversation. It's an invitation to a different kind of conversation, with ourselves, with each other, with the mystery of existence itself. If this video challenged you, made you think, or helped you feel less alone in your questions, hit that like button and subscribe to Logic Over Spirit. We're building a community of people who aren't afraid to ask hard questions and sit with uncomfortable answers. Drop a comment below. Tell me about your experience with divine silence, whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between. Let's keep this conversation going, and check out our next video where we'll explore another fascinating intersection of logic and spirituality. Until then, keep questioning, keep thinking, and remember, it's okay not to have all the answers.